All right, we will go ahead and try to get started this morning. As you can see, I'm not Hans. He wasn't feeling great, so he texted me Friday and was like on the fence if he was going to be here or not. And then Saturday let me know that he wouldn't be here this morning. So I'm going to be filling in. And I checked with him, and he was like, I already prepped for what I was going to do for Nehemiah, so if you could cover something else. I feel like when I'm the fill-in, I just like go back to, eventually we'll finish James. So that's what we're going to be in, the back half of James chapter 3, and hopefully we'll get through some, if not all, of James chapter 4 this morning. But I appreciate you all for braving the cold weather. I was like, trying to decide. Sometimes I get nervous up here and get warm, but I was cold, so I have my jacket on. But I'm going with just like normal attire, so we'll see how that goes. But anyway, we'll pick up in James chapter 3, verse 13. If you all want to be turning over there, and I'll go ahead and read to get started this morning from James chapter 3, verses 13 through 18. Who among you is wise and understanding? Let him show by his good behavior his deeds in the gentleness of wisdom. But if you have bitter jealousy and selfish ambition in your heart, do not be arrogant and so lie against the truth. This wisdom is not that which comes down from above, but is earthly, natural, demonic. For where jealousy and selfish ambition exist, there is disorder in every evil thing. But the wisdom from above is first pure, then peace-loving, gentle, reasonable, full of mercy and good fruits, impartial, free of hypocrisy, and the fruit of righteousness is sown in peace by those who make peace. So if you remember, I think it was back in October that we covered the first part of James 3. So if you don't remember, that's okay. But we were talking about people deciding to be teachers and thinking about the tongue. And so some of this can be seen as a little bit of a continuation of that, although we're kind of moving on to a different point about wisdom. But a lot of the things we talked about with the tongue and a lot of the strategies and characteristics that help you with trying to like control your tongue also apply to wisdom. So I think that'll be important for us to keep in mind as we talk through this. So to start with, why do you think James here in verse 13 says that in that back part, good behavior, his deeds, and the gentleness of wisdom? Why is wisdom referred to along with gentleness? Any thoughts on why it's referred to there with the word, the gentleness of wisdom?
No one wants to listen to somebody who's not gentle when they're teaching, or they're trying to cram it down your throat.
Right. Like, I think a lot of times what we learn in life as we think about wisdom is, we don't expect wisdom to typically come from somebody who's arrogant or somebody who's really mad all the time or all of these things, right? Like, we expect it to come from a place of, like, you're calm and you're talking through things and you're explaining something to someone. Yeah.
Wise, you know how to deliver a message without angering people.
Yes. Yeah. Good point, too. Did you got something to do?
Well, that godly wisdom or the righteous wisdom that he's talking about exhibits itself in that kind of behavior.
Yes.
Like any other thing in the heart, it's exhibited by your behavior, and that wisdom causes us to be more gentle.
Yeah, I think those are all good points. Maybe we got to take a step back. What does wisdom mean? Like, how would you all define wisdom? And maybe even if we can think about like how wisdom is different from knowledge, or however you want to approach that.
I always thought of wisdom as being what we do with knowledge that we have, how we use the knowledge we have.
Right. Yeah, I think that's a really good way to define it. Any other thoughts on what, when you see the word wisdom, what do you think of as we read through this? Yeah.
Well, I think it's us using our experiences that we've had in life,
Mm-hmm.
and also the knowledge that we've gained from it.
Right. Yeah, I think those are two good ways to look at it. Just thinking of like, in my mind, it was always like knowledge is more, if you're going to draw a hard line between the two, knowledge was like, okay, if I like read the Bible or I read some other book and like I gain these things, I know these facts and I know, either what I need to do or the stuff we've been studying like Ezra and Nehemiah, like I know all these facts and how many troops went and did this, or like, even in the New Testament, like here are the commandments I'm supposed to follow. but like that knowledge isn't enough, right? I can't just know those things or even know just who God is or know who Jesus is. Like wisdom is taking those things like we've discussed that we know and putting them into practice, or even like I've heard it sometimes described as like even like common sense versus like book smarts, right? Like the common sense is the things you figure out in life of like how to deal with certain experiences and like how to make things work and work with people, whereas like the book smarts is like what you learn from reading books and things like that. Both are important and we need both, right? Like it wouldn't do as much good to have this wisdom, and you can't really, in my thoughts, have biblical wisdom without knowing the Bible and knowing what God says, but like you need both. Yeah.
Example would be if you've lost somebody in your life and then somebody comes up to you that's never lost anybody in their life and says, oh, I know how you feel. They don't. They don't have any idea how you feel on that. So I think we have to be careful about saying things like that to people to make sure that if we've had that experience, then you could say, I'm very sorry for your loss. I can understand some of the feelings you've gone through since I've lost so-and-so. And that way they feel more like they can talk to you maybe about their feelings and that.
Right. And like even in that scenario, right, like I could probably go and find a book that talks about how to deal with grief or help someone deal with grief, right? And like if that's the best we've got in the whole congregation or in the whole group of people, then sure, I should still like try to be comforting, but it goes so much farther for someone who's like experienced that thing or a similar thing to have that wisdom of like, what was it like when I went through this? I can, help and relate to those feelings rather than like me just reading it from somewhere. So I think that's a really good way to think about it and divide that up. So I think with that understanding in mind, we can keep that in mind as we go through the rest of these verses. So then verse 14, based on what's written here, it seems like in the early church there was probably some jealousy going on and people being selfish. And these are directly opposite to the qualities that we just talked about of like the gentleness and having that godly wisdom and like being able to see that with the good behavior. So what do like people, I guess to start with, like if we think about people that have this bitter jealousy and selfish ambition in their heart, how do we know when someone's in that camp versus in the gentle camp? Like what kinds of behaviors do we see from them? How do we detect that, one in other people, but also, in ourselves to make sure we aren't doing that? Like, what does a person look like if they have bitter jealousy, for example?
They might distort their faces some, but I think a lot of it, if we're in a congregation, they would just ignore certain people because they were jealous of them. They wouldn't have, and they might talk about them some or something like that.
Right. Yeah, and I mean, I get that this is a hard one, right? Like, because it's hard to say, like, oh, I can look at, you and tell that you're jealous right now. But I do think when we think about it, like, we've all probably been jealous in here in our lives of somebody over something, right? And, like, there are a lot of maybe more subtle behaviors that we will see because of that. And sometimes there's much more public-facing behaviors that we'll see too. Yeah, Sarah, did you have
Oh, yeah, I was just thinking of, how some people will do the leveling thing and try and put somebody down to
Right.
raise themselves up.
Yeah, and I think those kind of go together of like a lot of times if you're jealous of someone, you're gonna try to find a way to like make yourself feel like you're on the same playing field or even that they're below you, right? And so you will exhibit certain behaviors of that. So like even if I'm up here teaching, right, if we think back to the first part of James, it might be me like trying to make somebody look dumb, who I think is like challenging my intellect or whatever, right? Like that's, hopefully kind of a silly example, but like something that may very well have been happening, in this time, right? Because we're dealing with people also who were like in the early church, like learning, they were getting some of these letters for the first time and like having to figure out what to do with the information that they were receiving. And they also had like the apostles who like were given this direct command from God and who had been with Jesus. And so there might have been all sorts of jealousy going on of like, well, why wasn't that me or whatever? Or how am I supposed to like keep up with people who've spent this time directly with Jesus? So I think that that's good for us to keep in mind, like the negative qualities that we might exhibit, to to make sure that we're not doing that. How does that play together with the selfish ambition in your own heart? Like, how do we know when someone's being selfish, you know, and I guess more in a public way? What are some things that we might see in their life or how they behave? Or even if you want to think about like in our own lives, like how do we know we're being selfish or that someone else is being selfish? Yeah.
I have a comment about jealousy also. Really, it's you that are the jealous person, and it can eat your soul to the point that you can't even, really commune with God in that because you're so jealous of this other person or group or whatever, and those people might not even know that about why you would be jealous about. So it's not really hurting that other person. It's all within you. And then also, then you become selfish with your time, not willing to give your time to maybe even come to services all the time or something, in and out, things like that you see. And so you become very, I think, withdrawn within yourself a lot of times with that selfishness.
Yeah, and I think that brings up like something, I thought about as I was preparing for this, I forgot to mention of like, I think one time it's easy for us to be jealous in the church is if we feel like we're working hard and doing a thing and somebody else gets like some public credit for something or, something like that. And we're like, well, I've been over here keeping this one effort afloat or I've been doing all these things or whatever. And like nobody ever gives me recognition, but this person, and I think that can be extremely difficult. Like, if you, like I feel like there's challenges with being up in front of people and nerves that you face, but also you get easier recognition because you're up in front of people. And so if you're somebody who chooses not to do that or is not able to do that, it can feel very hard sometimes. Somebody's like, oh, this person did a good job preaching. And you're like, well, I'm doing all these other things, right? And like, I don't get recognition for that. So I think that's something else that we can find ourselves, in jealousy around. And that leads to some of the like selfish ambition in our heart where we might hole up, or like the natural thing you say there is like, well, if I'm not getting recognition for this thing, I'm just going to stop doing it, right? Or like whatever. And then that is us being selfish and like, drawing away, like you're saying, or even like saying like, well, they don't even need me there, so I'm not going to show up anymore. So I think that's, important for us to keep in mind, and then also the back half of 14 that says, do not be arrogant and so lie against the truth. I think it's important for us to generally not be arrogant, but especially here, right? Like we don't want to be so arrogant. We want to have the wisdom to know that like all of us can fall into this trap, right? Like we can be jealous, we can have selfish ambitions. We should not do that. Even if we have achieved some level of wisdom, this can still happen in our lives. So we need to be very careful when it comes to that. And then verse 15 goes on to talk about how, there is this wisdom. It's not that which comes from above, but it's earthly, natural, and demonic. So what do you think this wisdom in verse 15 that James is talking about, you heard in the book of James here that we're talking about, what is if we're not talking about heavenly wisdom, what other kind of wisdom is there?
The news.
Okay, like the generally earthly wisdom, right? But like, it could be from the news, it can be like at our jobs, different areas of our lives where like, there is that same aspect, right? Of like people have gained knowledge in an area or a field or whatever, and they've learned how to apply it, and they can use wisdom there. So I guess first of all, is it wrong to have like earthly wisdom in certain aspects? I would think no, like we want people, I want my doctors that I go to have gained the knowledge of how to like heal and treat me, and I want them to apply wisdom both in how they go about that, but also like we talked about, like I would like them to be gentle with me, I would like them to explain things to me. So I don't think that's wrong, but we also have to watch out for what we see here. The earthly wisdom and what leads to like this jealousy and selfish ambition, is earthly and like demonic. And so, I think what that means is like it aligns with what Satan wants. It aligns with, things that we should not be focused on. So what would be some examples of like, this earthly demonic wisdom that we should not, exhibit in our lives. Like, have you all seen examples of ways that people use wisdom in bad ways, or things that we can think of here? Yeah.
I think when he's talking about this type of wisdom, he's referring back to those things in the previous verse. The bitter jealousy and selfish ambition and those things. And then he goes on to say, but there's lying, not to be arrogant and so lie against the truth. So sometimes when you have that selfish ambition or jealousy, would tempt someone to tell a lie about the other person or persons to, as someone's already said, to make themselves look better, but not just putting yourself up, but actually lie about them or gossip about them or throw them down.
Yeah, and I think that's really good, like tying those together, because I do think they go together, like to think about like how if you think about success in the business world, like how easy, you can have the wisdom to say, like, if I do these things and put this person down or make them look bad, I can get ahead, and you can apply that in a lot of different areas in life, and we would accomplish that by being arrogant and thinking we are better than them, and also lying to put them down. So I think that's a really good point. Yeah.
I think it's also when we become so involved in like people's lifestyles in that we sort of turn our own belief or knowledge away from what God says about certain lifestyles and that, because we know people and we have friends and we have coworkers that live these lifestyles. They're really good people.
Mm-hmm.
And sometimes I think you can try to overlook all of that, and especially in conversations. And that, I mean, I wouldn't just go out and blurt out all this stuff, because that doesn't help anything. I think that makes you arrogant looking and all that kind of stuff. But if it were in a conversation, then I have to have the wisdom, the kindness, and the knowledge to say certain things, because I don't want to ruin my coworker relationship, but I also have to know that God's expecting me to say something.
Yeah. Yeah, and so I think like through this we, can contrast like these qualities that we're supposed to be showing with our wisdom with what, we're not supposed to be doing. Like some of the other things that I had thought through with like these words specifically is like, when you think about earthly wisdom, it's much more short-sighted in the sense that it's how can I get ahead in this lifetime? So it's not thinking about the spiritual life that we have and where we're going to spend eternity and all of those things. So I think it's short-sighted in that sense, even though people who have that earthly wisdom make, some of the things, like if you're thinking about like, how am I going to invest my money, or how am I going to do this or that for retirement, that can be seen as long-term thinking, but it's not as long-term as we actually need to be thinking, right? So like there's that, like being focused on like the natural or the sensual in that second word, kind of thinking more like animalistically, like how can I get gratification immediately? How can I be focused on the things that are going to make me feel good at the moment, which we know as Christians we're not supposed to do, right? Like oftentimes those things that we find satisfaction in the moment are not the things that are good for us long term, and that's often sinful things feel good in the moment, but like, when we look back, we're embarrassed or ashamed of them, and they're ultimately going to send us down the wrong path. And then ultimately, like the word demonic, or like aligning, letting our soul be influenced by Satan and being focused on the things we shouldn't. And for sure, that's something that we don't want to be doing, right? Like he's constantly working against us in our lives to try to get us to do things we shouldn't, focus on the wrong things. So we need to be very cognizant of that. And these next couple of verses help even lead us into chapter 4 and talking about quarrels and stuff. But in 16 it talks about for where jealousy and selfish ambition exists, there's disorder in every evil thing. So have we ever seen that before? Hopefully not long term in the church, but I would assume that we might have been even seeing selfish ambitions and jealousy in the church, but in the workplace, like how does this disorder, like how do we recognize this? How do we know that this is happening, in our lives or at church or anywhere that we might see it coming about? Yeah.
In work, could not agree on something, and then it got to the point where people were yelling and screaming at one another. That was not any way good for any of us. You know,
Right.
It made hard feelings and stuff like that. So, and thinking about it, I mean, I even sort of joined in at one point and was like, oh, you know, they're just wrong, you know. And
Right.
it's like, well, maybe I'm not so smart either. You know, we needed to back down and really decide how to go about this issue in a professional manner.
Yeah, John.
There's a story that's told around St. Mary's that they brought in a new executive, and they start every one of their executive meetings off with a prayer. And this new executive said, why do we have to have a prayer before our meetings? And they said, it's in the name. It's SSM, Sisters of St. Mary's. They're going to have a prayer every time they have a meeting. And this, as the story goes, the new executive was like in shock because of that. But it's like, no, it's the way the sisters have always done things. It's the way they're always going to do things.
Yeah.
He was actually asking to eliminate it.
To eliminate the prayer.
Yeah. And I feel like that probably helps ground some of the meetings to hopefully head off some of, you know, the disagreements that you were talking about that we might face. Because I think, like, a lot of times we're going to find ourselves, like, in situations, whether, you know, like this can even happen here at this congregation, right, where we all naturally are going to think certain thoughts about things, right? Like I may say, I actually think this rug should be blue because I like Kentucky or whatever might be the case, right? Like there's silly stuff like that even that we'll argue over. Then there's much more consequential spiritual things that we will argue over as well. And I think a lot of times this comes from that either like I'm jealous of another person or I have these selfish ambitions in my heart that like I really want that and I'm going to push for that. And then everybody else is here. It's like we're in Wisconsin. It's going to be red because we like the Badgers, right? And like if we, you know, don't recognize when that's happening, right? Because oftentimes we're not to the point where we just, hopefully, we sit down in that meeting at work or whatever and we're just at each other's throats to begin with, right? Like, I think that can happen, but it's rare. But we, like, build up because we're each, like, so focused on what we want out of something and not focused on what, you know, the best outcome is that we can get way too focused on that. Yeah.
I remember being in a congregation where we almost had a split because we were building a new building.
Mm-hmm.
And it was just very heated conversation and things like that. But the elders asked that all the people gather together in the building, and then my dad was a preacher at the time, and they asked him to speak about this. And so they did, and he did, and I think people finally realized how silly this was. You know, the building's a building.
Right.
And it's not the building that counts. It's how we intermingle and act with one another and support one another. And luckily, it came about that, you know, the final decisions were made by the overseers and the church didn't split, but just to see how little things like that can really cause major consequences sometimes in people's lives.
Yeah, because I mean, you know, I've personally never been part of a church that's gone through a split, but I've definitely like heard stories and like, you know, sometimes it can be, you know, over doctrinal issues, but a lot of the time when you dig in, like it's more this person had a beef with this person and there were these factions that happened because of that, and like that's how the split goes. You know, and it's not my place to look at any of those churches and like sit there and judge or anything, but like I think we have to be very careful and make sure that we're exhibiting godly wisdom in how we deal with these situations, right? Because like there are things we're even looking for a new building right now and things like that, and everybody can have their own feelings about that, but we need to remember what's most important, like you mentioned, that we are here, we're together, we're unified, and we are here to bring glory to God, right? And it's not, you know, about my personal opinions on specific things. That doesn't mean they can never be brought up, right? But like we've got to be calm in how we approach that and have wisdom in how we articulate those things. So all good points there. So then let's look at what does this wisdom from above, you know, this godly wisdom look like. So we see first that it's listed as pure, you know, but like in my mind that means that we are focused on things that are not sinful, we shouldn't be focused on these things we've just talked about, of like having jealousy or selfish ambition. Like the wisdom we want is pure and focused on God and not focused on us, so that we can share that with others. Then we see, peace loving. So, and this kind of gets to what we've just been talking about, right? Like, what is our goal in the wisdom or the knowledge that we have? Is it to make myself look better than someone else and be right? Or is it so that we can like keep the peace? And like, sometimes there's a time and a place for like raising voices and being stern, but most of the time we can come to a peaceable agreement if we all have a level head. So we need to be focused on that peace and loving that peace. Gentle, kind of goes along with that, but is another layer that we've talked about making sure that we are like calm and collected as we, focus on the things that we're doing in life. Reasonable. I've seen some of the other commentaries I've looked at talking about like being willing to yield even for this. So like, there are going to be times and places to, for lack of a better way to say it, you're going to want to fight for something. You're going to die on that hill. But oftentimes there is a compromise or something that we can come to, right? Like if it's a doctrinal issue, then we need to stand strong on those things and like look to God's word for that. But like oftentimes the things that we're arguing about, especially in a congregation where we typically agree on things, are not those doctrinal issues, right? It's like matters of preference about how we feel about certain things that we're doing. And so we need to be like reasonable and understand that sometimes I'm not going to always get my way, and use that as a part of like the wisdom that we exhibit. We should be full of mercy and good fruits. So, we need to like, if someone has actually wronged us, right, or has done something, or we don't feel like they've done something right, like showing mercy to them and not holding that against them in future decisions or like how we interact with them, and the good fruits, right? Like we're all familiar with the fruits of the Spirit, but like just like those that we should be exhibiting as a Christian, wisdom has fruits. People who show wisdom, we should see their fruits. They're going to have ways that they exhibit that. We should be impartial and free from hypocrisy. So we need to make sure that we're not like treating people differently, in our lives, and have the wisdom to do that, and also not be hypocritical, right? Like it's great for me to know something. It's great for me to have the wisdom to say it. But if I'm repeatedly telling you not to do this sinful thing and I'm over here doing that sinful thing, like it doesn't do a lot of good either. So, we covered a lot of different qualities that we should have from this wisdom from above. Any of those that you all want to dive in on or have comments about how we exhibit those or how we might see those in other people? Yeah.
It's like when Paul said that, we're free to do and have any kind of meat we want. But if you're with a weaker brother, then you're not going to do that.
Mm-hmm.
I think if you're the stronger, maybe longer Christian and know a little bit more though about things, you have to be reasonable in the fact that you need to listen to those brothers or sisters who haven't gained all of this knowledge yet to see what their points are, and then be able to go to God's word and say, well, we need to look at this to see if that's correct or not. To, give them more knowledge about that.
Right, and like I think that's a good example that we can look back on in scripture where like if we have not struggled with a specific thing, right? Like so if I haven't sacrificed to idols or I haven't done this thing, then maybe I don't have the same association with that meat that this person does that causes them to struggle. I don't know if that's the actual case or not, but like I think part of having wisdom is realizing I have not personally been through every situation, and so this situation may be exceedingly more difficult for this person to work through than it would for me. And sometimes wisdom is I've been through this situation, and like I had a kind of rough time, but it's seemingly easy for me to get out of this situation. That may not be the case for another person as well. So I think another thing we have to recognize, even if we've been through a similar situation, is it might, for various reasons, be harder for another person, right? They might not have the same support system that we do, or they might have any other number of things working against them in their lives that make it harder for them to deal with. So I think it's important for us to remember that, when we are exhibiting wisdom in our lives, not just for the sake of showing it off, but like as we think about like what fruits we're producing and what's coming from our wisdom, like we can look at those things and assess how we're doing there. Any other thoughts on those qualities that we should have when we have the wisdom from above? All right, if not, we'll move on to verse 18. And the fruit of righteousness is sown in peace by those who make peace. So this kind of sets us up for what, we'll get started a little bit into in James chapter 4. But, if we remember even from Matthew 5:9, like Jesus says, "Blessed are the peacemakers, for they shall be called called sons of God." So, we know that righteousness comes by peace, and a big part of righteousness is people being peaceful. And we've kind of hit on this already, but this can be very valuable as we go through different portions of like our life here in this congregation and in our spiritual lives, right? Like it can be very easy for us to be at odds with each other about any number of things, but especially when we're looking at spiritual things, we need to be at peace with one another and calmly talk through things and not be focused on like fighting and whoever is right. So anyway, any last thoughts on James 3 before we turn over to James chapter 4? Yeah.
Peace doesn't mean rolling over and giving up.
Mm-hmm.
Sometimes there will be conflict. Sometimes it won't be. It will be painful, I should say, to achieve peace. So we need to be prepared for that. It's not always just going to go from a loud roar to quiet without a fight or a battle.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think that's an important thing for us to understand, and we can get into more detail on chapter 4, is that like not every situation will just like we meet for 30 minutes, we have that time in that room, and then we all go out and nobody has any feelings about what happened in there and we're all good, right? Like I think part of how we can apply wisdom from situations that I imagine most of us have experienced, if not all of us, is like when you're in those times and you have, something that, may even be appropriate that you've come to blows over, like how do you handle directly after that situation or until you have that situation resolved, right? Like if it's a situation that takes a month or more to resolve, right? You can't just be like, well, I'm not going to talk to that person until we come to a decision on this, right? Like, so even some practical things that we can do there is like, if we got heated with someone at a meeting, like go talk to them after and be like, hey, like I did this. I'm not even saying necessarily that I was wrong, right? I was standing up for what I believe in, but I want to make sure that like we're okay and like that we can still talk, because like I think most times in my life, anytime that's happened with somebody, like I have all this pressure in my head. It's like, oh, they're mad at me. And they're probably thinking the same thing, like, oh, I hope Josh is not mad at me. And like, if we go talk, we're like, yep, we disagreed. Yep, this is how we felt. But like, we can still be reasonable people. But if you sit over there and let all that like fester for months at a time and you don't ever talk, then it's easy to see how we get to like, this person's my enemy because like every meeting we seem to butt heads or whatever, every discussion, so I think that's good for us to keep in mind. Any other thoughts on chapter 3? Yeah.
I also like it when people share wisdom from the Bible and quote it from the Bible, so that I can also look it up myself, read the context, etc. It just gives it almost that much more emphasis or power to me,
right?
Because my opinion, God knows it all, whereas
yeah.
kids don't.
Yeah, and I think that's a really good point of like that we didn't hit much on, maybe except for the starting point, is like we need to go like true up the wisdom that we think we have with what's in the Bible by like regularly studying scripture, right? Because a lot of times I might think like, oh, I've handled this situation 20 times now, like I'm an expert in whatever the case may be, and I've like really diverted from like how God maybe wants me to behave in that situation, right? Like I might learn, as part of this earthly wisdom that I can just like browbeat people down to get what I want, right? And like maybe that works, like in the world, right? And like, so that could even work here in the church, right? Like if I have a dominant personality and I just like say it's going to be my way or the highway, I might get the results that I want. And like if I have in other regards a good heart, like maybe that's even the result that God wants, but I didn't get there the way that like I should have as a Christian, right? And like this all gets complicated because it's like, we need to constantly be going back and like measuring ourselves against what's written in the Bible to make sure like what we're doing in our lives is actually appropriate. So I think that's a really good point. All right, we're gonna move on and read at least the first couple verses of chapter 4. Does somebody want to read James chapter 4 verses 1 through 4 for me?
Where do wars and fights come from among you? Do they not come from your desires for pleasure that war in your members? You lust and do not have. You murder and covet and cannot obtain. You fight and war, yet you do not have because you do not ask. You ask and do not receive because you ask amiss, and that you may spend it on your pleasures. Adulterers and adulteresses, do you not know that friendship with the world is an enmity with God? Whoever therefore wants to be a friend in the world makes himself an enemy of God.
All right, thank you. So we kind of continue this topic of like the quarrels and conflicts that are happening, here in the early church, but they can also happen with us. So as we're thinking about this, let's think about like the time period that the early Christians were in as well. Would you how would you all rate that time? Would it be considered peaceful or not? What they were dealing with. And I feel like there's certain parts of that answer that you go either way, but I'm interested in what you all think.
They lived in an occupied territory.
Yeah.
They were being controlled by someone
Right.
else. They weren't free,
Yeah.
technically free at the time.
So they had like that going on, which is a good point that I wanted, to be brought up. It's like they were occupied there. It wasn't like the, Israel of old where like we've seen the kind of ebb and flow through time based on how they're following God, but it wasn't this like, oh, we have this great army or like whatever, right? Like they were being controlled by the Romans. But also like at this time, because Roman control was so widespread, unless you were one of the territories getting taken over by the Romans, like the Romans really liked to keep the peace, right? So like holistically across different nations and across different borders, like, there was some semblance of peace that maybe hadn't existed throughout the whole time of the Israelites. But then like we even see for like the early church, like Rome got tired of what was going on and like destroyed Jerusalem in 70 AD, right? Like, so there's like this whole like ebb and flow that they had to face of peacefulness versus not. Yeah.
It's like being a subcontractor.
Mm-hmm.
You're working for a company, and you have autonomy within your group. But for final approval, you have to go back to the parent company and ask
Right.
them if it's okay.
Yeah.
And that's kind of how the Jews.
And it's like all those layers can either cause more or less strife than might be if you were on your own. So, we've got that kind of going on in the world around these Christians who would be reading this book or hearing this book. And then we get specifically into what is the source of quarrels and conflicts among them. And like I said, this kind of hits on some of the things we've already touched on from the last chapter. But what does verse 1 call out as the main source of what causes them to wage war and have the quarrels?
Pleasures.
Yeah, passions and pleasures and all the things. And like, when I hear those words in this context, that just makes me think of like how sin is described, right? It's like us doing the things we want to do, putting what we want ahead of other people, ahead of what God wants because we want it, and it brings us happiness in the moment, or it makes us feel better in the moment, right? And like so much of the Christian walk is recognizing that and then not doing those things or not prioritizing those things, because sometimes it might even be something that's like inherently wrong, but we focus on money too much, or we focus on what we have too much. And it's not wrong to have money, or it's not wrong to have things, but we're so focused on having more than someone else, or being ahead in some way, that we're not focused on the right things. So I think we can see how that would contribute to things. And then we get into some more specific things in verse 2 and following, talking about you lust and you do not have, so you commit murder. And like part of what I read here, just in some of the stuff that I was referencing, was talking about like it's unlikely that like tons of murder was going on in the early church, and like it was just a bunch of people like having this and feeling this and murdering each other. Like maybe some of that was going on, but also like the point was trying to be made here that, like, you know, this can lead to that, and you are doing a lot of things that are bad to other people because you want and you don't have, and maybe they have it, and so it's causing that jealousy that we talked about before, and you're not focused on the right things. So you know, hopefully we don't let that bubble up to the point of murder, but I think we can see that in our lives, you know, without getting to the point of having that much jealousy, but like we have jealousy and it causes us to do things that are unfavorable to other people. You know, and then verse 2 goes on to say, you are envious and cannot attain, so you fight and quarrel. You know, so we've kind of hit on these points already, but like I think a very specific thing that we have to watch out for is becoming jealous because someone else has something that we don't have, right? Like that can be material, that can be status, that can be whatever. Yeah, Jesse.
Mention of selfish ambition.
Mm-hmm.
And that's what, and the murder is not necessarily killing somebody, it can be wishing they were dead.
Right. Yeah, and I think that's a really good point. You know, that I had in my notes and forgot to mention was like one of the things I read said, you know, this gets back to when Jesus was talking about different things. You know, and he was like, it's not just if you commit adultery; it's if you think about committing adultery, right? And like for this, you know, maybe they weren't actually committing murder, but you were thinking about it or thinking about acting on things that you shouldn't because of those selfish ambitions that you have. So I think it's so, you know, we've talked about this a lot today, but I think it's so important because we all will struggle with this at various times in our lives to some degree, right? Like we're all, as humans, we just see people like in situations and we're like, I want that situation, or I want that thing they have, or I want whatever. And we have to work so hard to like control and fight against just like leaning into that and doing whatever it takes to get that, and rather understand and focus on the things that we do have. Or as we'll get into with verse 3 and 4, some of why we may not have what we want is because we're not asking for it, right? So like verse 3 goes on to say, you ask and you do not receive because you ask with the wrong motive. So like how many times might we even be praying for something that's in the right direction that we're jealous because somebody else has whatever thing spiritually that we don't have, but it's because we're asking with the wrong motives, right? The wrong motive can even be, I just want this, you know, ability because this other person has it, rather than I want this ability to glorify God, right? Like it's a silly example. If I think Michael's a way better song leader than me and I'm like, God, I want to be a better song leader so I can like, you know, worship you better. That's a better motive than if I want to be a better song leader so I can be better than, you know, somebody else here. So I think we have to be very careful, even though that's not a bad thing in and of itself. It's like, you know, we've got to be careful about how we approach those things and how we ask God of those things. So with the, you know, and then that's kind of where I thought we would get today. But I wanted to spend the last minute or two that we had, though, thinking about when we find ourselves in that situation and we, you know, don't have something because we asked and we didn't receive because we have the wrong motives. How do we change our motives, right? Like that's not as easy as me just going, yep, I've got the wrong motive. Let me have the right motive. Like it's a hard question, but like, do you all have thoughts on how we approach changing our motives when we like ask for things or just in general? Yeah.
Well, I think we need to speak to people who've been in the church longer about certain things like that, because they might have been through something like that. But I also think we have to sit down and start reading and, you know, searching for that particular answer. It'll be there.
Right.
We just have to search it to find out what he says about it.
Yeah. Yeah. So I think, you know, talking to others that can encourage us in the congregation who may have been through more things, like we've been discussing kind of all class, and then also, you know, spending time in God's Word. Like the closer that we get to God, I think our motives and things that we want out of life tend to fall better into place. And so I think that that's important for us to keep in mind. Are there other ways that you all have found that work for you to like change what your motives are, change what you're focused on? Yeah.
Pray about it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that's another really good thing, right? Like if even if I'm not asking for something, I find myself, in the verse that we're in, and I'm asking for the wrong motives. Like I can be asking God to help me have the right motives, help me focus on things in the right way. Because sometimes I don't understand how to get there, but like in just even talking to God about it and recognizing I have the wrong motives, that can help me get on the right path. Any other thoughts? Yeah.
Sometimes you have to speak to that person that has that wisdom, that has that experience like Teresa is.
Yeah, and I mean, I think that is something that we probably all could do a better job of, like recognizing that there are other people, especially here in this congregation, that we could be talking to and leaning on more to learn things instead of like figuring out, like I feel like I always find myself in life like I'm just going to figure this out on my own, and like you end up figuring it out the hard way instead of like leaning on others and learning from them. So I think that's a really good point. Any other last thoughts before we close this morning? All right. If not, I think we'll be picking back up in Nehemiah chapter 8 next week. If Hans is feeling better, so we'll go ahead and take a break before service starts this morning. Thanks, everybody.